We are a little bit different in the sense of like, we don't typically recommend anchoring in an industry as your first step. Um,
What do you mean by anchoring in an industry?
so let's say you like, hey, I want to buy a business. Then the next best question that everyone asks is, what business should I buy? Right. And so
Logical.
a lot of times people will ask me, well, what kind of businesses do you think I should buy? And my response is always like, I have no idea because I don't know you. Right. And so I would never recommend buying a business based on trends, right? Like, well, right now, HVAC is like all the rage. I don't know if you've seen memes on Twitter about being an HVAC owner right now and having all the suitors in the world at your door. But to if you don't have the right background, skill set, value proposition to actually add value to an HVAC company, then you should not buy one, right? So we really anchor in figuring out what your unique um, kind of skills, experiences, successes that you can then replicate in a business is best for you. And unless you have some overarching strategy, like we have members that are doing a roll up in a very specific space, they'll be industry focused. But if that's not you, then there's no need to just kind of like pick an industry because you don't really know what's out there. Like I still see businesses that I'm surprised, and I've been doing M&A for 11, 13 years
Yeah.
and consulting, and like I still see businesses where I'm like, oh, that didn't think that would be a business, right? And so if you pick an industry just arbitrarily, it seems kind of unnecessary, right? It's an unnecessary barrier to put up. We would recommend that you instead spend the time to get to know yourself, figure out who you are, what value you've historically added to businesses so that you can find a business that needs that versus find an industry. Because, like, let's say you decide you want to buy an HVAC company and you have a background in sales and you want to buy a company and they've never done sales, right? So you're buying a HVAC company, they've always been word of mouth. You go in and you're like, okay, this is a great fit because I can come in and I can do sales, right? That's fine unless the owner who's leaving was an operator and you have zero operations experience. Because now when that guy walks out or that girl walks out, they're going to leave this giant gaping hole. You're adding sales, which is great, but you're not filling this hole. And so this is a great company for you if somebody, for example, is going to be staying and you're going to give them equity or something to kind of keep them engaged and make sure that gap is filled. But just because the business is good for someone doesn't mean it's right for you, right? It could be a great business on paper, but if you don't fit, like I always tell people, I view organizations as like jigsaw puzzles, right? Like I'm very much a systems thinker being an IO psychologist. And so it's very important that you understand what your piece looks like so that when you find a listing, you're like, yes, that needs my piece, right?
You just covered two key points that I want to reiterate there because they are so critical. When I started so I've been involved in M&A inside corporate world, but I wasn't the one obviously going in and finding the business and defining what we were doing as a corporation. So my role there was very different. But when I started looking at businesses outside of that sort of world, that was the first question. Okay, so what do I bring to the table? What business do I want to do? But I already have a business and we're fractional operators. So I know I want to add on to that area specifically and what I'm looking for. Do I want things that generate more leads? Do I want things that generate more for whatever? And so there are things that you look for depending on your situation that could be totally different than the person sitting to your left or to your right. And I think it's really critical that you've just talked about that, as well as the other piece, which is the key man risk. So we talked a lot to our clients as operators and talk about the fact that, if they're the chief cook and bottle washer, that's a problem. We need to fix that to make their business more saleable. So somebody coming in will not be left with, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I needed an operator or I needed a salesperson or whatever it was.
I think growth. So two things. What you've just referred to. So everybody thinks about key man risk, but the biggest value lever, if you're thinking about selling or you're thinking about buying, is transferability, right? If a business isn't transferable, then the value goes down significantly, right? So when you hear about like average multiples, you're not going to pay an average multiple for a business that's not transferable. I don't even know that I would finance a deal that's not transferable, but that's a whole nother conversation. The second thing that you're talking about that I think is super fascinating is growth through acquisition, right? So you have an existing business. The fastest way to grow that business is to acquire, right? Either like firms, customers, vendors. And so I think growth through acquisition is one space we've started playing more in over the past, like, I'd say the last 3 years. The first year was very much like individuals. And then we started to really get more substantial growth through acquisition folks, right? And growth through acquisition is kind of what my background is. And so figuring out the fastest way to get multiple expansion, which is what everybody's trying to do, right? When they're buying a company, is grow it and then sell it for a higher multiple because you add revenue and earnings. Growth through acquisition is the fastest way to do that, but it's also really risky, right? Because buying a company as a person is very different than buying a company as a company, right? There are different considerations that you have to be making, right? To buy a company that you already have a culture, you already have people and processes. Now you want to buy another company that also has people and processes. That's where the culture clash that everybody always hears about with M&A comes into play.
Yep.
Whereas a human, like, you have to worry about culture clash to some extent, but it's more about like personality and management style when it's an individual buying a company, than it is, growth through acquisition. Growth through acquisition is probably the most consistent strategy that our members have, in the sense of nobody, I won't say nobody, we have like 750 buyers. So I'm sure one of them maybe doesn't want to grow through acquisition, but most people don't want to just buy a company and stop, right? They want to buy the company, at least grow it. Most of the strategies with growth is going to be to do another acquisition at some point. And so I think people think that, okay, well, I bought a company, I can do it again, but they don't realize that they're not doing it again. They're doing a completely new thing, right? Because an acquisition isn't a growth through acquisition. It's not the same thing, right? Buying a company and adding one to an already existing is a lot messier. And then different considerations need to be taken into account.
I'm going to share a story with
that.
that, because that happened actually. One of my very first experiences in the corporate world with M&A was one of those. It was growth through acquisition. So we were a pharmaceutical company in the animal health space. We bought an add-on that was great. It was perfect fit for us. And the owners were aging out. They wanted to, they'd spent 20 years in the business. They're like, hey, we've got great value. Let's just walk away at this point in time. So we had acquired the company because we thought it's in this more random and remote location. Let's pull things out and move it to our main office in the country, and we can get some efficiencies out of it. Great. So we go through the acquisition. We come back to the table a year later to evaluate, because of course that's what we like to do. You want to look back and say, did we actually tick the boxes that we wanted to? The answer was no. The answer was, it was actually more efficient to leave it where it was and keep it running and humming, and then add to that. And then all of a sudden we 3x the company within 2 years. Totally different experience than what we walked into it expecting for operational efficiencies. That was the reason we were buying it. It was interesting.
I think that operational efficiencies is one of the biggest motivators for growth through acquisition, and it almost never works. And I don't know why. Although I was just reading the new HBR when I was at the airport in May, maybe May, maybe not, maybe it was a trip in July, but regardless, the new HBR talks about updated research on like failed mergers, and they don't fail anymore. And I think a lot of it is because they employ people with my background. Now that my background is more widely known, you pretty much can't find a M&A team that doesn't have an industrial organizational psychologist as part of it, right? And I think part of the reason why these projections don't work is because they are not realistic, right? Number one, they're anchored in historical performance without recognizing the impact of change on performance, right? And it takes 18 months for change to actually take hold, right, in a company. And it doesn't take into account the drop, right? I think people talk about the J curve. It's like you're going to drop in performance after a transaction almost all the time, right? Because everybody loses focus of the business during the transaction itself. And then you're inserting a bunch of change to the system. And so it's your first priority is just to stabilize. And a lot of times I look at projections and they're like, I'm going to get 10% growth my first year. I'm like, has it ever gotten 10% growth ever? Get alone in like the most tumultuous period ever? Like, do you really think that? And I get it. A lot of people will like manage two sets of projections, one for like, forward facing and one for like, this is actually what's going to happen. But I'm a realist. So I feel like, shouldn't we just go in like eyes wide open and be like, okay, so we're going to drop the first year. How are we going to recover? But I think part of it from a growth or acquisition perspective is because they don't think about change, period. Like, I don't feel like anyone thinks about how change disrupts a system, what the change journey looks like for people and all of that jazz. For individuals, I think there's a lack of recognition that it's going to decline initially, and that you just need to sit back and observe to make sure everything works for the first like 6 months or so, and you're just getting your bearings. And like, so realistically, the first year is kind of a wash. I think you can have successes, obviously, right? But like, planning for substantial growth your first year is likely gonna, not bode well. Maybe plan for like a little bit of growth in like the fourth quarter.
keep it stable. That's
like literally, you just
Yeah.
don't want to decline. Like, you just want to stabilize, And so I think that when an individual buys a company, at least I talked to, I don't know, thousands of buyers at this point since starting the lab. And the biggest challenge I see with the folks, number one, they think about buying outside of their geography, which, to each their own. Everyone can do whatever the heck they want. They're adults, right? But then they forget to include the financial impact of traveling, right? So the hotel cost, the flight cost, the gas cost, whatever this additional overhead is created by traveling to a site, a week out of the month or 3 weeks out of the month or 4 weeks out of the month or whatever it is, it wasn't accounted for. And so they either don't account for growth, or they don't, or I mean, for cost of travel, or they don't account for growth, right? And so when I talk to people about, well, what size company should you buy, a lot of times there's literally no consideration for growth. It's like they have all these plans of like, oh, I'm going to add a sales team. And I'm like, awesome, that's a pretty high cost growth strategy. How are you going to pay for that? They're like, well, the revenue from the business. I'm like, have they been able to pay for sales team and pay you? And is that what earnings are? Like, do you know how math works? Like, I don't think that's how this works. And so I feel like those are the two biggest like gaps, right? That they're not taking into consideration. And then it makes the projections not work.
So when you say account for growth, you're talking about the accounting for the growth strategies that as a new owner, you want to put into place, just assuming, hey, this is pretty cool, I'm going to go ahead and do this. That's a really interesting one to talk about, because the owners at any stage, I find, they need the cash flow, they need the forecasting, they need to do it properly in order to account for, well, do I have the money in the budget to actually afford this strategy or that strategy? As a new owner, new buyer, really looking at that through the due diligence process and asking those key questions would be very interesting to see what comes back. Hey, we wanted to do that, but we never got around to it. Well, why?
I think that would be really fascinating. I think for me, the reason our acceptance rate is so low in the lab is because I will walk through the math with everybody on every strategy call. And most of the time the math doesn't math, right? Like, I'm like, so how much money do you need to pay yourself in order to sustain your standard of living? And they're like, well, 200,000. I'm like, okay, well, what size business are you targeting? And they're like, 200,000. I'm like, okay, well, how are you financing the deal? Are you paying cash? I'm like, no, I'm financing it with the bank. And I'm like, okay, well, that doesn't work because you have to pay back the debt, right? And that can be half of your earnings, especially in today's market. And actually more than that in today's market. But then we talk, okay, so that means you need to buy substantially larger than you were thinking. What are your growth strategies? And they're like, well, I'm going to execute a new digital marketing. Like, my background is digital marketing. They've never run ads. I'm going to run ads. I'm like, okay, that is a massive cost, right? And like, you're buying a business and you're accounting for all the earnings currently, right? With how you're paying yourself, paying down debt. How are you planning on growing if you don't also plan for the budget for the ads? Yeah. Right? And so it's like, it's how much you want to pay yourself, how expensive are your growth strategies, what's the debt service, and then any additional operating costs. Maybe you need to replace your health benefits. Maybe you still want to retire, you want to contribute to retirement. Maybe you want to pay your taxes. I don't know. Maybe you want to build your cash reserves back up quickly because working capital burns out real fast, right? And it's always underestimated. And so it's like there's all these other things that they need to be thinking about when you're buying so that you don't get in and get cash poor, right? And either sacrifice growth or sacrifice paying yourself, right? One of those will have to be sacrificed if you're not budgeting for it up front.